I am Sarah, and I can no longer ignore the fact that the perfect reunion I once dreamed of with my husband is long gone. John and I, once so full of love, now exist side by side in our house as two people simply fulfilling their obligations. He works, I take care of the house. We both pretend that everything is fine, but I can feel my days slipping away, and something is wrong in our marriage. I think about it as I lie in bed, unable to sleep. It's like everything around us has frozen, and I can't remember the last time I felt like he was truly there, with me. In the beginning, it was different. We would talk late into the night, making plans for the future, laughing at silly things, making love with a sense of urgency and excitement. But now, silence fills the spaces between us. We pass each other in the hallways, only exchanging the faintest of nods, as if the years of shared history have somehow evaporated. I remember the feeling of his hands, the warmth of his touch, but those memories seem distant, like they belong to someone else. Our home is no longer a place where we can retreat to find comfort. It's just a house, cold, uninviting. I try to focus on the small things, the chores, the routines that fill the empty moments. I clean the kitchen, fold the laundry, cook dinner. But even as I do these things, I feel the weight of my own discontent growing heavier. The sadness settles in, and I wonder if John even notices. In the quiet of the night, lying next to him, I stare at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us like a physical barrier. I reach out to touch him, but there's no warmth, no response. He is asleep, lost in his own world, and I am wide awake, overwhelmed by the thought that this is all there is now. I don't know how we got here, but I fear that this is the way it will always be. This life, this marriage, is a shell, and I am trapped inside it, watching it slowly crumble. Everything changes when John invites his nephew, David, to stay with us for a while. He's in his late 20s, just out of college and struggling to find his footing. John had always talked about how much he wanted to help him, and when the opportunity arose, he didn't hesitate to offer David a place in our home until he could get settled. At first, I was indifferent. I thought it might be good for the house to have someone else here to break the monotony of our routine. John was excited, even a bit proud that he could do this for his nephew, and I didn't want to disappoint him. So I said nothing as we rearranged the guest room and prepared for his arrival. David moved in a few days later. He was polite, respectful, and made an effort to blend in with our family life. He would help with chores, bring us coffee in the mornings, and offer small compliments like telling me how well I had cooked dinner or how nice the house looked. I found his attention flattering at first, almost refreshing, but I didn't think much of it. It was just kindness, right? But as the days went by, I began to notice something different. It wasn't so much what David did, but how he did it. There was a subtle intensity in the way he looked at me when we would talk, an undercurrent that I couldn't quite place. At first, I chalked it up to his being young, eager to fit in, to find a connection. But then his gaze lingered a little too long, and his compliments felt more like observations. There was something unsettling about the way he seemed to study me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I couldn't explain it, but there was a shift in the atmosphere of our house. It was like his presence was quietly rewriting the dynamics between John and me, and I didn't know how to respond to it. Every time David smiled at me or reached out to pass me something, I felt my heart skip a beat, as if there was something more beneath the surface that I wasn't ready to face. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. After all, I was married. I loved John, didn't I? But why did David's presence make me feel like I was losing control of something that I had always thought was solid and unchanging? Something was stirring, something that I couldn't ignore, and I didn't know whether it was exciting or terrifying. At first, I convinced myself that I was overthinking everything. David was just being polite, just being friendly. There was no need to make it something more, something dangerous. But it became harder to ignore as the days passed. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was everything. His presence in the house started to feel different. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries in the kitchen, David walked in. I had my back to him, focused on the task, when I felt a shift in the air. He was standing just a little too close. I hadn't heard him come in, but his presence felt heavy, almost electric. My hands froze for a moment as I grabbed a can of beans, and I could feel him watching me. I told myself to ignore it, to just keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice soft, almost too soft. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He reached past me to grab a bag of flour from the counter, and for a brief, terrifying moment, his fingers brushed against mine. It was the kind of touch that was innocent enough on the surface, but beneath it there was something else, a kind of quiet intention. I felt my pulse quicken, a strange warmth rising in my chest. I quickly pulled my hand away and turned to face him. "Thanks, I've got it," I said, trying to sound casual, but inside, everything felt different. The tension in my chest, the quickening of my breath, made me realize that something had shifted, something between us that wasn't quite right. The next few days only made things worse. David began to compliment me more often, but it wasn't just about how I looked or how well I was keeping up with the house. It was the way he looked at me when he said it, as if he was seeing something I couldn't see myself. One morning, he caught me off guard while I was making breakfast. I hadn't bothered to put on makeup or do my hair, and I felt more exposed than I had in a long time. "You look beautiful," he said, and his voice was so sincere that it almost made me blush, even in the mornings when you're not trying. His words should have felt like nothing, just another compliment from a young man trying to be polite, but instead it felt like he was pulling me into a space I wasn't ready to occupy. I stammered a response, but the words died in my throat. I didn't know how to respond, how to tell him that I wasn't interested, that I didn't want this attention, that it wasn't right. But despite myself, I started to crave it. The way he made me feel, seen, appreciated, was something I hadn't felt in so long. I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't just flattery. It was something more, something deeper. And as much as I hated to admit it, it was becoming harder to ignore. The truth began to dawn on me. My heart was responding to him in ways I didn't understand. I wanted to run, to escape this uncomfortable tension, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to distance myself, I only seemed to draw closer, and all the while, in the back of my mind, I knew this was dangerous, knew I shouldn't be allowing it to continue. But it wasn't just David's attention that pulled me in. It was the distance between John and me, the silence that had settled between us for so long. David was a reminder of something I thought I had lost, something I thought I didn't need to feel anymore, but now it was all I could think about. It had been building for weeks, the tension between David and me. I told myself it was nothing, just fleeting moments. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, after John left for a business trip, David and I were left alone in the house. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken words. As we sat side by side, I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't ignore the way David's presence seemed to pull me in. Suddenly, he was closer, his arm brushing against mine. I froze, feeling the heat of his skin against mine. It wasn't intentional, or so I told myself. But when his hand found mine, I couldn't pull away fast enough. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. I should have stood up, but I didn't. His gaze held mine, intense, knowing. He didn't speak, but in that moment, everything shifted, and before I could stop myself, I let my hand touch his again. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that I had crossed a line I didn't know how to uncross. We stayed there, both of us silent, the air thick with something I couldn't name, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that things would never be the same. The moment I touched David's hand again, everything inside me screamed to stop, to pull away, to pretend it had never happened. But it was too late. That moment had planted a seed, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me, like a secret I was no longer able to keep. I tried to tell myself that I was just lonely, that I was craving some form of attention I hadn't gotten from John in so long. It was easy to rationalize it, easy to blame the distance between us, the years of silence. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was complicit in this. I was choosing to let this happen. Every glance from David, every subtle touch, was like a thread pulling me further from the life I knew. I started to wonder if he knew exactly what he was doing, how carefully he would navigate around me, how his eyes would linger just a little longer than necessary. His compliments were gentle, almost too sweet to be entirely innocent. I caught myself looking forward to them, waiting for his next word, his next gesture. He made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't in years. The guilt weighed on me, but there was something else, something that gnawed at me even more. Desire. It wasn't just about feeling seen, it was about wanting him. My body responded to him in ways I didn't understand, and every time I tried to push it away, it came back stronger. I couldn't make sense of it. I loved John, I told myself. I had spent years building a life with him, a family. Yet here I was, with David, unable to ignore the feelings that were growing inside me. It was like I was trapped in a web I had spun myself, and the more I tried to escape, the tighter it became. The shame was unbearable. I had betrayed everything I believed in, but there was no going back now. I felt myself sinking deeper into a hole of confusion and temptation, and every time I saw David, every time he got closer, I felt like I was losing myself more and more. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine, that I was still in control. Every moment with David felt like both a temptation and a consequence, and as much as I hated it, I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. That night, everything finally exploded. The air in the house felt charged, crackling with an energy that I couldn't ignore. John was gone again, and I found myself alone with David in the house. The tension that had been building for days had reached its breaking point, and neither of us knew how to stop it. We were sitting together in the living room again. This time there was no pretense, no distractions. David didn't speak, but the silence between us was thick with something unspoken. He was closer than before, closer than I should have allowed. His presence overwhelmed me, and I couldn't look away from him. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. My breath caught in my throat, and in that moment, everything inside me screamed at me to move, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. David's hand brushed my cheek, gently, almost reverently, and I felt the warmth of his touch spread through me like fire. My heart raced as he leaned in even closer, his lips hovering just a breath away from mine. I could feel the tension between us, building, pulling us together, and then, without thinking, without any more hesitation, he kissed me. It was soft at first, a tentative press of lips, as though he was testing the waters. But the moment his lips met mine, I felt something inside me break, something inside me that had been holding me together, holding me back, shattered into pieces. His kiss was slow, gentle, but there was an undeniable urgency to it. I felt my body responding against my will, my arms reaching for him, pulling him closer. I should have stopped. I should have pulled away, told him that this wasn't right, that this wasn't who I was. But in that moment, all I could think about was how it felt to be kissed like this, to feel desired, to feel wanted in a way I hadn't in so long. The kiss deepened, and I could feel my body aching for more. Everything else, the guilt, the fear, the consequences, faded into the background. There was only him and me and the heat between us. When he pulled away, both of us breathless, I knew I had crossed a line that I couldn't uncross. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts a tangled mess. This was a moment I would never be able to forget, and as much as I tried to fight it, part of me didn't want to. The kiss lingered in the air between us, like a forbidden secret that neither of us could fully acknowledge, yet both of us knew had changed everything. That night, I lay in bed, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't bring myself to face the consequences of what I had just done, but I couldn't ignore it either. Every part of me, every fiber of my being screamed with guilt, but in the back of my mind there was something else, something dark, something thrilling, that wouldn't let me forget the feeling of David's lips on mine. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Each time I passed him in the hallway or sat beside him in the living room, I felt the weight of that kiss hanging over me. But it wasn't just the kiss, it was everything that had led up to it. The way he made me feel seen, the way his eyes seemed to understand something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. I felt like I was spiraling, losing myself in something I couldn't control. The guilt was crushing, but I also felt a pull toward him that I couldn't shake. It was like an addiction, a need I had never known before. I found myself seeking his presence, lingering in rooms where he might be, finding excuses to talk to him, to be near him. Every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, it felt like the world around me narrowed down to just the two of us. I knew it couldn't last. I knew I was playing with fire, and sooner or later the flames would consume me. What I didn't know was how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was normal, that nothing had changed. The worst part was that I could feel John growing more distant. He hadn't noticed the shift in our marriage. Not yet, but I could see it in the way he went through the motions of life, barely looking at me, barely speaking to me. I was sinking into something I couldn't control, and at the same time, I was watching my marriage with John slip further and further away. The shame weighed on me with every passing day. I had betrayed the very thing I had promised to protect, the life I had built with John. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to push David away, the attraction, the desire grew stronger. I couldn't deny it anymore. I had crossed a line and I didn't know how to go back. Every look from David, every subtle touch, pushed me further into a corner I was afraid I might not be able to escape from. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. I couldn't keep pretending that I was still the woman I used to be, the woman who loved John with everything she had. I could feel it all unraveling. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I wanted it to stop. It all came crashing down one evening, in a way I had feared but never truly expected. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There were no accusations, no violent outbursts. It was quiet, painful, and inevitable. I was standing in the kitchen with David when I heard the door open. My heart dropped. I didn't need to look to know who it was. John had come home early, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. We had no time to prepare, no time to hide the truth of what had been happening. David and I froze. We both heard John's voice in the distance, his keys rattling in the entryway. He must have noticed the silence in the house, the stillness that had settled like an unspoken weight between us. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every part of me was paralyzed with guilt, with fear of the inevitable. David's presence beside me felt like a betrayal in itself, but it was too late for anything to change now. John stepped into the kitchen. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on us, I saw it, the recognition, the pain. He didn't say anything at first. His face was unreadable, his expression tight, his jaw clenched. He just stood there, taking in the scene. And I knew in that moment that he understood. He saw us. He saw everything. We didn't need words. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. John's eyes met mine, and I felt the weight of everything we had lost. The love, the trust, the years we had spent together, crashing over me. His gaze wasn't filled with anger or rage. It was filled with something far worse, disappointment. He had already made his decision. Without a word, he turned and walked out. It wasn't the shouting, the confrontation I had feared. It was the quiet finality of his departure that left me breathless, paralyzed in the moment. David looked at me, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to do, what to say. Neither was I. But the truth was clear. My marriage was over. John had seen enough to know that nothing could save it. I stayed there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch as everything I had once known, everything I had once believed in, crumbled before my eyes. And in the silence that followed, I realized I had no one left but myself to blame. David was still standing beside me, but his presence didn't offer any comfort. it didn't erase the guilt that had consumed me, the shame of what I had done. And as I stood there, alone in the aftermath, I knew that there was no going back. Everything had changed, and now there was nothing left but the ruin of what once was.